Folks around here say the Blue Ridge holds secrets older than the oldest tree rings, and I guess I half believed that when I used to haul timber out of the ridges between Roanoke and the Georgia line. It was the fall of 2018, the air crisp as a fresh-cut apple, and I was finishing up a solo night run, my rig loaded with pine. I'd stopped along a narrow overlook near Bent Mountain to check a rattling chain. My wife, Marlene, always nagged me about working nights, but the pay was better, and the quiet of those twisting roads felt almost holy. I'd been hauling timber since my daddy taught me the routes, and I knew every dip and switchback by heart. Usually the dark never spooked me much, even when owls shrieked or coyotes yipped unseen. That night felt different somehow, like the silence was pressing in from all sides. The stars were bright as sparks in black velvet, and a low breeze carried the sharp scent of pine needles. I remember wiping my hands on my jeans and feeling a shiver that didn't come from the cold. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for me to notice something I couldn't yet see. I've always been a man who likes to know what's what, so I bent down beside my trailer, shining my flashlight under the chassis. My boots crunched over gravel and tiny pine cones, and my breath fogged in the beam of light. I kept telling myself the noise I'd heard was just a loose chain smacking metal. Marlene's voice echoed in my head about how I'd end up in some newspaper story. Local man vanishes off mountain road. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest rustle from the tree line about 30 yards off. I glanced that way and froze when I saw two bright yellow dots staring back at me. At first I thought they were reflectors someone nailed to a tree, but then they blinked, slow and deliberate. My skin crawled with goosebumps, and my mouth felt dry as sawdust. I straightened up fast, half expecting some drunk hunter to stumble out. But nothing moved except those twin points of light, steady and unblinking now. I called out, a shaky, "Hello?" that sounded too thin in the vast darkness. Whatever it was didn't answer, but the eyes disappeared, as if the creature had sunk lower into the brush. I waited, ears straining for footsteps or twigs snapping. Instead, the hush deepened, and a sound began, a low, throaty growl, rolling out of the trees like distant thunder. It didn't sound like a coyote, bobcat, or bear, all of which I'd run into over the years. It was deeper, stranger, almost deliberate, like someone imitating a beast's voice. The hair rose on my arms, and I took a step back, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. The light caught on something pale and sleek, moving between trunks, but only for a second. My mind screamed cougar, though part of me wondered if it was something else. There was a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe, as though the woods themselves were leaning closer. Then the growl stopped, cut off as if a switch flipped, and silence came crashing back around me. I thought about investigating, but my gut twisted, warning me not to. As I turned toward my cab, I heard a sharp rustling right behind me, like paws or claws scrabbling over gravel. I spun so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight, but there was nothing there, just empty road and mist creeping over the guardrail. My headlights flickered once as though something had passed in front of them. But when I looked again, the overlook was empty. The only trace left was a faint musky scent, like wet fur, that hung in the cool mountain air. I checked my chain one last time with trembling fingers, then climbed back in my rig and locked the doors tight. My pulse was thudding so hard I could barely hear the engine. I kept glancing in my mirrors as I drove off, half expecting to see those eyes trailing me. In the end, I convinced myself it must have been a cougar nosing around my truck, though the pale shape I saw seemed too big for any cougar I'd ever known. Yet the second I looked again, whatever it was had vanished, and the shadows seemed deeper, the rustling louder, like the woods were alive and closing in. I never did stop at that overlook again, no matter how much my chains rattled. Sometimes, when I'm driving that stretch, I'll catch a glimpse of yellow glints in the trees, and I keep on rolling without slowing down. Folks can call me superstitious, but I've seen enough strange things in those mountains to know better. Anyway, let's go to the next one. Back in 2004, I was working as a park ranger in the Chattahoochee stretch of the Blue Ridge, near the Georgia line, and one September night, I ended up on trail patrol later than planned. I was 32 then, single, and I often volunteered for the late shifts because I loved the hush that fell over the woods after sundown. It felt like the world held fewer expectations when the sun slipped behind those blue ridges. That evening, the moon was a silver dime behind thin clouds, and the smell of damp leaves hung thick in the air. I'd parked my truck near a trailhead off Route 180, thinking I'd do a quick sweep before heading home. The forest was restless that night, leaves whispering like gossiping voices. Crickets sang so loud it felt like they might drown out any other noise. I kept glancing into the shadows between trees, feeling oddly watched. I chalked it up to fatigue, though the hairs on my neck refused to settle down. Folks say you shouldn't ignore that feeling in the Blue Ridge, but I was stubborn back then. I'd just reached a bend where the trail narrowed between rhododendron thickets when I heard a dry rustle, like something brushing against bark. I clicked on my flashlight and swung it side to side, expecting to see a raccoon or deer. Nothing. My boots crunched over fallen twigs as I crept forward, scanning every dark shape. The undergrowth smelled sharp and earthy, a mix of wet dirt and crushed leaves. Then I heard a low huffing sound, almost like a deep sigh, but heavier, coming from somewhere ahead. It made my skin tighten across my shoulders, though I told myself it was a black bear. Bears huff like that when they're warning you off. But this sound was longer, almost vocal, and it echoed strangely between the trunks. I swallowed hard, shining my light into the gap in the thicket. I caught a glimpse of something large and dark moving away, the leaves shivering in its wake. I took a few careful steps closer, though every part of me screamed to turn back. The ground dipped slightly there, and the damp soil squelched under my boots. My light flicked over what looked like deep claw marks gouged into a tree trunk, fresh enough that pale wood still glistened beneath the bark. My brain insisted it was a bear's work, but the slashes were higher than I'd expect, and wider apart. I thought maybe it was two bears fighting. Then, clear as day, I heard what sounded like words, just two syllables, husky and almost human, spoken low in the shadows. My breath hitched, and I snapped my light toward the sound, but the space was empty. A sudden breeze pushed through the thicket, carrying a musky scent, animal-like, but somehow not quite right. The forest seemed to lean in closer, listening, holding its secrets tight. That was when I finally lost my nerve. I turned and started back down the trail, trying not to run, though my legs felt like springs ready to snap. Behind me, twigs cracked as though something heavy was pacing along in the darkness, just beyond my light's reach. I glanced back only once and saw two glints, like wet eyes catching the glow of my flashlight. They blinked slowly and vanished behind a bough, heavy with leaves. My heart was hammering so hard I felt lightheaded, and the night seemed to close around me like a lid. I kept moving, not daring to stop again until I saw my truck's shape waiting in the parking lot. I scrambled inside, locked the doors, and sat there, panting, staring into the trees for a long minute before starting the engine. I told myself, over and over, it was just a bear, acting strangely, maybe one sick or injured. But those claw marks were too high, and that voice, no bear, makes a sound like that. Still, I'll never say for sure what I saw, because I didn't go back to check. The woods can keep their secrets if they want to, and this is just the beginning. What comes next still keeps me awake at night. It was late summer of 2011 when I took a job fixing fences for a cattle rancher up near Fancy Gap, Virginia, where the Blue Ridge runs like a spine across the land. I was 39 then, divorced, trying to keep busy and out of my own head. Most days I'd be out there at dawn and not come home until after dark, the woods and fields my only company. Folks say the ridgelines up that way swallow sounds and bend light, and I used to laugh it off. But there was this one evening, a dusty pink sunset hanging over the hills, when I stayed too long finishing repairs near a creek. I'd just slung my tools in the back of my truck and lit a cigarette when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. No crickets, no cicadas, not even the breeze moving the grass. The cows had drifted off toward the far pasture, leaving me alone by the fence line. I stood there listening, feeling like someone was waiting for me to turn around. The sky had gone from pink to a dark violet, and shadows stretched longer than they should have. I was rolling up some leftover barbed wire when I heard a chuffing noise behind me, soft but deep, like air pushed out of a big set of lungs. I spun around fast, my heart thudding so hard it made my chest ache. The trees across the creek were packed tight, black shapes stacked against the fading light. For a moment I saw nothing, just the flicker of my truck's taillights reflecting off the metal fence posts. Then something pale slipped between two trunks, low to the ground, but moving with a smoothness that made my scalp crawl. I thought it might be a cougar, though it seemed bigger than any I'd ever seen in these parts. I listened hard, straining for more sounds, but the creature stayed hidden. A faint smell wafted over the creek, musky and sour, like wet fur mixed with old leaves. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I inched toward my truck. My boots squelched in the soft bank as I stepped closer to the water's edge. That's when I saw the tracks in the mud, 4 toes, but longer and skinnier than any cougar print I knew, and spaced far apart, like whatever made them had a big stride. I leaned down for a better look, the dusk shadows pooling around me. The hairs on my neck rose straight up, and I got this sudden chill, even though the air was still warm. The creek burbled on, uncaring, while the woods fell back into silence. I told myself it had to be a cat, maybe sick or injured, explaining the odd gait and smell, but something in my gut kept screaming that wasn't the whole story. I stood up quick, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw 2 eyes glowing amber, fixed right on me. They blinked once, slow, as if whoever owned them was deciding something. I stayed frozen there, the scent growing stronger, wrapping around me like a damp blanket. The eyes disappeared behind a thick swirl of rhododendron leaves. I took 1 step back, then another, each footfall loud as a gunshot in the quiet. The evening air felt thick enough to choke on. My cigarette burned down to the filter in my shaking fingers. I heard a single splash in the creek, like something heavy stepping into the water, and that's when I finally snapped out of it. I turned, stumbled to my truck, and nearly tore the door off climbing inside. My keys slipped once before I managed to crank the engine. I didn't look in the rearview mirror even once as I tore out of there, gravel spitting behind my tires. I keep telling myself it had to be a cougar, maybe just curious or defending territory. But those tracks were wrong, and the way it moved was off somehow. I've fixed plenty of fences since then, but I never go back to that creek near dusk. The Blue Ridge can keep its shadows, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, let's go to the next one. People in these parts believe the Blue Ridge fog can hide more than just trees, and I remembered that one spring night in 2015 when I was working late at the little gas station off Highway 23 near Rabun Gap, Georgia. I was 26 back then, living paycheck, saving up to move somewhere bigger and brighter. The station closed at midnight, and my last task every shift was dragging the trash out back to the dumpster that sat beside the patch of woods. Usually it was no big deal, but that night the fog rolled in thick as sheep's wool, swirling around the floodlights until everything seemed to vanish beyond a few feet. The smell of damp concrete and gasoline mixed heavy in the air. I remember shivering in my thin uniform shirt, hugging my elbows, wishing I'd brought my jacket. Even the highway seemed deserted, the usual rumble of trucks swallowed by the white gloom. It felt like the world had shrunk into a tiny pool of yellow light, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. My manager always said, "If the fog comes in heavy, get your tail inside." But I'd laughed that off. Until that night. I was halfway to the dumpster, trash bag swinging at my side, when I heard claws clicking on pavement, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening, my ears straining as the sound echoed softly off the building walls. I squinted into the swirling gray, expecting a stray dog or maybe a raccoon. The sound drew closer, steady as footsteps, each click sharp as glass breaking. My breath felt shallow, and the plastic bag crinkled in my shaking fist. Then I heard a low grunt, deep and rough, almost like a pig but drawn out, with an edge that made my skin tighten. My pulse pounded so hard, I felt lightheaded. I tried to call out, but my voice stuck in my throat. The claws scraped even closer, and I caught a glimpse of a dark shape hugging the edge of the cinderblock wall. It moved smoothly, like it was sliding rather than walking, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw a pale stripe running along its back. I forced myself to take one cautious step back, though my legs felt like wet rope. The creature shifted again, revealing two small black eyes set wide apart, glittering wetly in the harsh yellow light. It looked at me the way a predator sizes up a meal, calm and calculating. The fog twisted around its shoulders, hiding its full shape, but I could see the outline of muscle rippling under a hide that seemed hairless, though maybe it was just slick with mist. My brain kept whispering bear, but bears didn't crawl that low to the ground, or move so silent. I kept thinking mountain lion, yet the proportions were off, longer in the body and almost reptilian at the hips. A smell drifted over the dumpster, sharp and foul like wet straw mixed with something metallic. My eyes watered, and I wiped my sleeve across my face, refusing to look away. The creature gave another grunt, then swayed slightly, as though ready to spring. Suddenly the thing lunged forward 2 steps, and I stumbled back so fast I nearly fell into the puddles, slicking the concrete. Its claws scraped a metallic shriek against the dumpster, and I heard a low growl, the sound rolling through my chest like a passing truck. I dropped the trash bag, the contents spilling and scattering across the wet pavement. The creature froze, nostrils flaring, sniffing the spilled garbage. My heart was hammering so violently I thought it might burst. It shifted its weight, muscles bunching, eyes flicking between me and the trash. My only thought was getting inside before it decided I was more interesting than leftover burritos. I turned, bolted for the back door, and slammed into it hard enough to rattle the glass. My key fumbled in the lock as I tried to shove it in, hands trembling so badly the metal clicked uselessly against the brass. I finally managed to fling the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut and locking the deadbolt with shaking fingers. Inside, the humming fluorescent lights seemed too bright, too sterile, as though they couldn't keep out whatever lurked outside. I pressed my face to the narrow window in the metal door, peering into the fog, but the shape was gone. The trash lay scattered across the pavement, slick and shining under the security lights. I told myself, over and over, it had to be a bear, Or maybe a big raccoon, sick with mange, making it look hairless. But I keep remembering how smoothly it glided, and how those eyes seemed too knowing. To this day, I've never taken the trash out alone after dark again. Anyway, let's go to the next one. My name's Hank, and I've worked as a surveyor up and down the Blue Ridge Parkway for close to 25 years. But the strangest night of my life happened near milepost 312 in North Carolina, back in October of 2019. The leaves were blazing red and gold, and the mountains seemed to glow under the harvest moon. I'd stayed out later than usual, checking boundary markers after a week of rain that had turned the soil to mush. My partner, Dave, had left early, so it was just my flashlight and the dark hush of the forest pressing close. I'm not the superstitious sort, but folks in these mountains talk about things moving between the trees that don't quite belong. That night, the breeze carried the smell of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. The road was empty, not a single car passing for over an hour. My boots squished in the soggy ground, and each step felt like I was sinking deeper into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. The woods felt watchful, as though the trees had grown eyes. I was working my way back toward my truck when I heard a snapping branch off to my right, deeper in the undergrowth. I swung my light toward the sound, thinking deer, maybe a bear rooting around for acorns. The beam cut through the mist, catching drops of water hanging on the rhododendron leaves like tiny glass beads. Another crack, closer this time, and my heart thudded faster. I could feel the cool air on my cheeks as I stepped toward the noise, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then came a low crooning sound, almost musical, rising and falling in a pattern too steady for any animal I'd ever heard. It made the hair on my arms stand up. My pulse was drumming so loud it felt like thunder in my ears. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The singing cut off instantly, swallowed by the damp hush of the forest. That's when I saw it. A set of eyes glowing green in my flashlight's glare, about waist-high above the ground. They blinked once, slow and deliberate. I tried to focus the light, but the shape stayed hidden behind a stand of mountain laurel. I thought bobcat at first, but these eyes were set too far apart, and the shape seemed too bulky. My mouth went dry as I realized the thing wasn't moving away but swaying side to side, like it was sizing me up. The crooning sound started again, softer now, coming from deeper inside the thicket. A sharp, bitter scent hit my nose, like a mix of wet moss and sour milk. I felt a prickle of sweat along my spine, though the night had grown cold enough to see my breath. My boots slipped in the mud as I tried to shift my weight without making noise. I kept telling myself it was just a bear making strange sounds, maybe injured or sick. Suddenly the creature lunged forward 2 paces, and I caught a flash of pale fur along its flank. It stopped as quickly as it had started, staring at me with those unblinking green eyes. My legs nearly buckled beneath me. I thought of snapping a photo, but my hands were shaking too hard to hold the phone steady. The crooning noise rose in pitch, like a warning or a question, echoing off the trees, until I couldn't tell where it came from anymore. My breath came fast and shallow, as the shadows seemed to thicken around me. I backed up, inch by inch, careful not to turn my back on the thing. Another crack sounded to my left, as though there were 2 of them circling. I couldn't stand it any longer. I spun and ran, crashing through brush and saplings, until I reached the gravel shoulder of the parkway, panting and soaked with sweat. By the time I reached my truck, the singing had faded away completely, as though it had never been there. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it so hard my knuckles hurt, staring at the dark trees on either side of the road. Part of me insists it was a bear making weird noises, maybe driven out by hunger. But I can't shake the feeling that what I saw that night wasn't quite a bear, nor anything else I've ever read about in a wildlife manual. To this day, I still avoid working near milepost 312 after dark. Sometimes, when the wind's just right, I swear I hear that crooning on the breeze. This is nothing compared to what's coming up. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I went to check the fence behind the barn, or so I thought, out here on the Virginia side of the Blue Ridge near Buena Vista. I'm Carla, 43 years old, widowed 4 years now, and I've been running this small farm alone ever since. The land is beautiful but demanding, and by the time dusk rolls in, my bones feel every bit of the work. That evening the sky was a strange shade of lavender, heavy clouds rolling low over the peaks. I was carrying a hammer and a few nails, planning to patch a loose board where the cows kept pushing through. Crickets chirped like usual, but the sound seemed distant, swallowed by the hush between wind gusts. I smelled rain in the air and wanted to finish fast. My dog, Jasper, usually follows me everywhere, but for some reason he stayed up on the porch, their ears pinned back. I laughed at him, called him a coward, but deep down felt uneasy. The shadows around the tree line seemed thicker than they should have been for early evening. I was crouched by the fence, hammering in a nail, when I heard a crack of wood behind me, like a branch snapping under weight. I paused, listening, my breath puffing out white as the temperature dropped fast. Another crack followed, closer, slow and deliberate. I turned my head and stared into the pines, half expecting to see a deer nosing around. Instead, the trees stood motionless, dark and crowded, like a wall. My heart started beating faster, but I kept working, telling myself it was probably a raccoon. Then I heard something exhale, a long, rattling breath that sounded too deep for any small animal. Goosebumps crawled up my arms under my flannel shirt. I clenched my jaw, trying not to show fear, even though I was alone. The wind died completely, leaving a silence that felt unnatural. I hammered one last nail and rose slowly, scanning the tree line. That's when I caught sight of movement low to the ground, gliding between the pine trunks with a smoothness that made my skin prickle. My first thought was bobcat, but the silhouette was longer, and its back seemed arched like a cat about to pounce. A pair of eyes glowed amber in the fading light, fixed right on me. For a split second, I glimpsed something pale along its shoulders, almost like stripes, though it vanished before I could be sure. The thing paused, crouched low, head swaying side to side, as if deciding what to do next. A sharp, acrid scent drifted over on the breeze, burning my nostrils and reminding me of old copper pennies. My hammer felt useless in my hand. I tried calling out softly, "Hey there," as though I was greeting a stray dog, but the creature didn't flinch or blink. It just stared, perfectly still, the orange glow of its eyes bright against the dark. Suddenly it let out a sound, a single yowl, sharp and harsh, like metal scraping across stone. The cry echoed through the trees and sent a bolt of terror down my spine. I took a step back, my boot catching on a rock, nearly sending me sprawling into the mud. The creature shifted forward, claws making tiny scratching noises on the fallen leaves. I thought of mountain lions, but I'd never heard one make a noise quite like that. My pulse raced so hard, I felt it in my fingertips. The shadows seemed to surge forward, as though the woods themselves were leaning in to listen. I took another step, trying not to run, though every instinct screamed to flee. Jasper began barking wildly from the porch, hackles raised, his voice high and desperate. That gave me the jolt I needed. I turned and bolted for the house, not daring to look back. Inside, I locked the door and dropped my hammer on the kitchen floor, chest heaving, sweat slick on my forehead. Through the window I could see the tree line still and quiet, as though nothing had happened. Part of me insists it was just a bobcat, acting strange, maybe rabid, explaining the odd behavior and smell. But another part of me can't forget how deliberate its stare felt, like it was weighing me up. I've checked the fence in daylight since then, but I never go back there after dusk. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that scraping yowl drifting through the trees. Anyway, let's go to the next one. Last November, deep in the folds of the Blue Ridge near Ellijay, Georgia, I was driving back from visiting my sister who lives further up the mountain. I'm Paul, 58, retired postal worker, and I've spent most of my life on these winding roads. I'd left her house later than planned, and by the time I hit the gravel stretches of Forest Service Road 28, the sky had gone pitch black. A cold drizzle misted my windshield, and my wipers thumped a steady rhythm. I've always loved driving through these mountains, even at night, but that evening felt off somehow, like the darkness had grown heavier. The rain smelled sharp and metallic, mixing with wet leaves scattered across the road. My headlights picked out glistening tree trunks and low-lying fog rolling across the curves. I slowed down to avoid hitting deer, which often dart out without warning. The radio crackled with static between stations. I glanced at my dash clock, noticing it was just past midnight. I rounded a tight bend, easing off the gas, when I saw something standing in the middle of the road about 30 yards ahead. My headlights caught a pale shape, hunched low as if sniffing the gravel. My first thought was a coyote, though it seemed too big and stocky. The creature raised its head and stared into my beams, eyes shining a pale gold that almost looked reflective, like glass. For a moment, we both stayed frozen, neither of us moving an inch. The drizzle hissed against my windshield, and the smell of wet earth seeped through the cracked driver's side window. I shifted my hand to the gear stick, ready in case it charged. The creature blinked slowly, one eye closing before the other, which struck me as odd. Its breath steamed in the cold air, drifting sideways on the wind. My pulse thudded hard enough that I felt it in my throat. I rolled forward a few feet, hoping to scare it off. Instead, the creature took 2 slow steps backward, still facing me, as though it didn't want to turn its back. Its shoulders moved in a rolling motion, strangely fluid for something so large. My headlights glinted off a patch of fur along its side that seemed patchy and pale, like old scars or missing hair. The creature opened its mouth slightly, revealing rows of teeth, but no snarl came out. Instead, a deep chuffing noise rumbled from its chest, almost like a bear warning someone off. Yet its posture was all wrong, too low, too cautious, almost cat-like. My mind darted between bear, cougar, maybe a sick dog, trying to force the pieces into something familiar. A sour smell hit me then, bitter and pungent, like wet leather left to rot. The creature tilted its head as if listening. Suddenly it dropped lower to the ground and slunk off into the trees with a speed that shocked me. Branches shivered where it slipped through, but there was hardly any sound for something so big. The road lay empty again except for the drizzle glinting in my high beams. My heart was hammering so violently I felt nauseous. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, eyes locked on the spot where it vanished. A distant owl hooted from somewhere high in the canopy, and the forest settled into silence. Part of me wanted to get out and check for tracks, to prove to myself it was just a bear or a mangy coyote. But the memory of how it stared at me, almost like it recognized me, kept me glued to my seat. I swallowed hard and shifted into gear. I convinced myself later it must have been a bear with mange, giving it that patchy fur and odd posture. But I've never seen a bear move like it was deciding whether I was prey or an intruder. And those eyes, there was something almost calculating in them. I haven't driven that road after midnight since, and I doubt I ever will. Folks can laugh if they want, but there are things in these mountains that don't fit any book description. That was nothing compared to the next tale. Some folks say it'll give you chills. In the Ozarks, they always warn you about things that watch from the trees. And though I'm not from there, I thought about that saying last spring while hiking near Peaks of Otter in Virginia. My name's Denise, 41, born and raised in Lynchburg, and hiking's been my therapy since my divorce 3 years back. I was trying to clear my head that day, following a narrow trail that wound along the ridgeline, high enough that clouds skimmed the tops of the pines. The sun kept slipping behind gray clouds, casting patches of shifting shadow across the ground. Birds called overhead, but the deeper I went, the quieter the forest seemed to grow. My boots crunched over fallen needles, and the air smelled cool and sharp, like rain on stone. I'd passed only 2 other hikers all day, and for a while I enjoyed the solitude. Then I reached a hollow where the light seemed to fade, even though it was barely 4 o'clock. A hush fell over the woods, pressing close as a held breath. I stood still, listening, one hand resting on the strap of my pack. The silence felt heavy enough to hear my own pulse. That's when I caught a flicker of movement on the slope below the trail. A pale shape, slipping between rhododendron bushes. My first thought was deer. But the movement was too smooth, almost like a cat stalking low. I edged forward carefully, leaning out to peer down the slope, trying to catch another glimpse. A branch cracked, sharp as a rifle shot, echoing off the ridge walls. I jerked back, scanning the underbrush for antlers or the twitch of a white tail. Instead, a guttural growl rose up, low and bubbling, like rocks tumbling underwater. It didn't sound quite animal, or at least not any animal I'd ever heard. My skin crawled with goosebumps, and my throat felt dry as dust. I glanced around, half hoping someone else was nearby. The growl faded, leaving a tense silence in its place. I crouched low, peering between the dark leaves, and saw 2 eyes reflecting green in the dim light. They were spaced wider than any deer, set low to the ground, and blinking slowly as if considering me. A shape shifted behind them, long and sinuous with pale markings along its back, like stripes or scars. I held my breath, afraid even a whisper might draw it closer. The creature inched forward a few feet, silent except for the soft scrape of leaves. A sour, coppery scent drifted up the slope, strong enough to make my stomach flip. My brain kept insisting bobcat, but bobcats don't get that big, and they don't glow like polished marbles under the trees. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear the breeze rustling through the pines. I felt exposed on the trail, like prey on a stage. The creature suddenly froze, head tilting to one side, as though it had heard something further off. Its body tensed, then it pivoted and melted back into the shadows, leaving only trembling branches behind. I stayed crouched there for several seconds, chest heaving, eyes straining into the gloom for any sign of movement. Everything smelled damp and earthy again, as if nothing strange had happened. The birds slowly started calling once more, cautious at first, then louder. I forced myself to stand, knees weak, scanning the trees for those green eyes. Part of me wanted to follow it, to see what it really was. But another part whispered that curiosity could be dangerous in the Blue Ridge. I turned and headed back down the trail, moving quicker than before. I kept telling myself it was just a bobcat acting oddly, maybe sick or injured. But bobcats don't have a body that long, or eyes that seem to look through me instead of at me. And I sure don't know any animal that growls like it's speaking underwater. I've hiked that trail since, but never alone, and never late in the afternoon. Sometimes, when the light starts to fade, I get the feeling I'm being followed again. Anyway, let's go to the next one. Back in 2009, over near Dahlonega, Georgia, I was working a seasonal job as a groundskeeper at an old lodge perched on the Blue Ridge slopes. My name's Travis, 45 now, but I was 29 back then, restless and eager to save up enough cash to hit the road. The lodge was mostly empty during the off-season, and some nights I'd be the only soul on the entire property. That November, the cold settled in early. The trees stripped bare, and the sky the color of iron. One particular night, I was finishing up my rounds near the back cabins around 10 p.m. The porch lights cast long yellow stripes across the frost-slick boards. A wind whistled through the bare branches, making the lodge creak like an old ship. I'd always enjoyed the solitude until that night. The mountains seemed closer than usual, like walls leaning in on me. The air smelled like wood smoke and frozen earth. I was locking the utility shed when I heard a scuffling noise behind me, like claws scrabbling across gravel. I spun around, shining my flashlight between the cabins, expecting to see a raccoon, or maybe a fox. Instead, the beam caught on a pair of eyes glowing red-orange, low to the ground, but spaced further apart than I'd ever seen on a small animal. My breath hitched, fogging in the cold air. The creature didn't move at first, just crouched there, watching me. My pulse hammered so hard I could barely swallow. I inched closer, telling myself it had to be a big dog, maybe a stray from the highway. The thing shifted, revealing a slinking body, fur matted and patchy, like it had been burned in places. A harsh, sour odor wafted toward me, stinging my nose. I spoke softly, trying to soothe it, but my voice cracked halfway through. The creature answered with a low growl, rising into a sound that almost mimicked a human groan. The noise rolled through the dark like a warning. My flashlight trembled in my hand as the beam jumped over its pale flanks, catching glimpses of long limbs and curved claws. It took one slow step forward, and I saw its shoulders hunch like a big cat about to pounce. Yet its head seemed too flat, and the ears were missing, as though torn off. My stomach twisted as a fresh gust of wind brought the smell of wet fur and rust. I wanted to run, but my boots felt glued to the ground. The creature blinked slowly, its eyes narrowing as if trying to recognize me. For a few seconds, the night seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, it lunged sideways into the darkness between two cabins, so fast I nearly fell backward from shock. Branches rattled as it slipped through the bushes, and the night swallowed it whole. I listened for footsteps, panting hard, but the forest was dead silent again. I waited, heart pounding, afraid it might circle back around. But all I heard was the faint crackle of frost on the leaves and the distant rush of wind over the ridges. My legs finally worked, and I backed away slowly, eyes darting everywhere. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers numb and shaking, then practically ran across the lot to the lodge's main door. Once inside, I locked everything and turned on every light I could find, pacing the lobby like a trapped animal myself. Later, I tried to convince myself it was a coyote with mange, or maybe a dog that had been injured. But coyotes don't stare like they're weighing your soul, and they sure don't sound like they're trying to speak. I worked there another 2 weeks, but I never stayed outside after dark again. Even now, sometimes I wake up at night, smelling that sour, burnt scent, like it's drifted in through the cracks. Anyway, that wraps up our stories for today. Thanks so much for riding along through these strange tales of the Blue Ridge. If you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out the other stories we've shared. There's plenty more waiting for you in these hills.